Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art criticism and writing here at the School of Visual Arts. This conference, Critical Information Mapping the Intersection of Art and Technology, was conceived and planned by 7 of our graduate students here: Alex Alanche, Kareem Estefan, Noah Dillon, Margaret Graham, Diana Seho Lee, Leanne Norman, and Colin Sunt. And they chose the 7 faculty respondents for the panels today: Suzanne Anker, Susan B., Michael Capio, Tom Hoon, Ann Lauterbach, Nancy Princenthal, and Kurt Rowski. And they did this all under the careful, watchful eye of their faculty advisor, Russet Letterman, and with the invaluable and always incredible assistance of Annette Wareham. Thank you. And thank everyone who participated today. Let's hope the conversations begun here will continue into the future. McKenzie Wark writes about media theory, critical theory, and new media. He's the author of Virtual Geography, 1994, The Virtual Republic, 1997, and Celebrities, Culture, and Cyberspace, 1999, all focused on the cultural space of his native Australia. After immigrating to the US in 2000, he co-wrote Speed Factory, an experimental work about distance and expatriation. And then in 2004, he published a Hacker Manifesto, and in 2006 and 2007, Gamer Theory. His most recent book is The Beach Beneath the Street, The Everyday Life and Glorious Times of the Situationist International, published this year by Verso. He recently also wrote 2 pieces on Occupy Wall Street. The first was called How to Occupy an Abstraction, in which he described OWS as a weird global media event, a concept that he developed beginning with his first books, and also as an event in that nobody knows what will happen next. And the second was called Zuccotti Park as Psychogeography, in which he asked the question, after observing life in the park on a given night, how is it possible to create forms of life for ourselves, even if it's in the shadow of tall buildings that cast long shadows? The last time I heard McKenzie Wark speak, he was standing in the shadow of the Washington Square Arch, wearing bright red shoes and using the people's mic to talk about zombies and the birds of Minerva that flock at dawn. Today he's going to talk about a different set of spectacles of disintegration. Please welcome McKenzie Wark.
First of all, I'd like to thank the student committee of the MA in Art Criticism and Writing for the invitation. And since David named them all, you'll know who to blame if you don't like it. So, just putting that out there. And I'm not someone who changes titles, but I did. I recalled it Blue Ruin. Who could have guessed that when the flood came, it would come in slow motion, over 40 decades rather than 40 nights, as the polar ice sheets unravel and plunge into the waters? Those who have so mismanaged the fate of all things cling to their private arcs. The animals, one by one, will be saved, if at all, as gene sequences. What confronts us now in our still cosy worlds are spectacles of disintegration. There's probably not much one can do to prepare American culture or polity to deal not with its future, but with the very texture of the present. It wants to hide under the covers. As the philosopher Theodor Adorno might put it, let's not let the power of others or our own powerlessness stupefy us. We can prepare the space of education and the space of writing and the space of art joyfully by inventing new practices where aesthetics and techniques meet. That's the kind of practice there may soon be plenty of call for. One understanding of art, Adorno's, for example, would make it the antithesis of anything technical. Technology partakes in a certain kind of abstraction. It creates a grid through which to reduce qualities to quantities. The place of art is then to be a refuge for the qualitative. Art is where that which cannot be reconciled with an ever more abstract world makes its last stand. I take a different view. I think of art as a different way of experimenting with given technologies. Art is a kind of practice which finds out what you can do in a space, a given space, of possibility. Art is about abstraction also, just as much as technology. It just uses different methods. This kind of abstraction has nothing necessarily to do with abstract art in the sense of abstract versus figurative art. All art is figurative, it's just sometimes the figures aren't human. Richard Taylor, a physics professor at the University of Oregon, maintains that some of Jackson Pollock's paintings are actually fractals. But one might just as well say that Pollock's paintings are figurative, but the figures are not human forms, they're mathematical forms. And while it's interesting that a scientist finds fractal geometry in Pollock, it's not that we now discover what Pollock was really doing because we can model it mathematically. It's rather that art is always experimenting with the possibilities of abstracting away from certain habits within a given space of materials. So Pollocks are not fractals, maybe fractals are Pollocks. You could see it the other way around. Art that seems to be figurative, in that it has representations of human figures, for example, may also be abstract. Impressionism, for example, was, among other things, exploring the possibilities of new kinds of industrially produced pigments. Modern chemistry was really changing the substance of our world at a molecular level. And one expression of that is the experiments conducted by artists with those very materials. There's one sense in which one can think about art as, this is one sense in which one can think about art as modern. Art was a space not for retreat from abstraction, but for playing out the possibilities in an experimental fashion. Whatever manifestos the artist signed, and no matter what readings we may put on, say, a Turner painting of a locomotive, the practice of making art was caught up in experimenting with the technical possibilities of abstraction. What I think changes is that we now know how all this ends. The capacities of abstraction seize hold of the materiality of all around it, opening up its potentials. Modernity was a great liberation front. Only it wasn't about liberating a people or a class or a gender. What modernity liberated was carbon. Modernity liberated fossilized carbon in the form of oil and coal and natural gas. Modernity fired its great engines on these fossils. Think of Marinetti crashing his Bugatti and writing the Futurist Manifesto about it. Modernity released enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to change the climate of the whole planet and possibly forever. So climate change is the modern fully realised, the modern as tending towards undoing its own conditions of existence. Mitigating its effects is going to take all the ingenuity, technical, aesthetic, not to mention social and political, that we can muster. And mitigating climate change is not just a technical problem. The economy will not just naturally adjust. There's no hiding from it in romantic back-to-nature fantasies. I mean, I'm sorry, we're just not going to save the world by eating artisanal cheese from upstate. It's not going to work. So if we refuse to deal with abstraction, then like Martin Heidegger, the best we can do is throw up our hands and say only the gods can save us. A giant inflatable dog turd broke loose from its moorings outside the Paul Klee Centre in Switzerland and brought down power lines before coming to a halt in the grounds of a children's home. The Paul McCarthy sculpture, the size of a house, reached a maximum altitude of 200 metres. Other civilizations had their chosen forms, from the obelisk of Luxor to Michelangelo's David. Marinetti found his crashed motorcar more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace, but he might have balked at flying dog shit. In the 21st century, the insomnia of reason does not breed monsters, but pets. No wonder there are no longer any gods, when what is expected of them is that they descend from Mount Olympus with plastic baggies and clean up. Or in other words, there are no gods to save us, and not even Heidegger. There's a role for art, however, in its experimental practice which charts the possibilities within a given technical domain. The end game of modernity raises the stakes for this game. Art has to experiment much more broadly across scales. Both microscopic scales and planetary scales come into focus as things that are related and interconnected. Art can no longer be about a separate domain where the planetary scale, climate, and the molecular scale, carbon dioxide, when the planetary scale, climate, and the molecular scale, carbon dioxide, are linked in their fates. Art can either engage with this fate by being a practice that is open to the kinds of experiment that might be needed to mitigate such a fate, or art can become a contemplation not of origins but of ends. The Domain of Arnheim is a strange story by Edgar Allan Poe in which a young man who inherits an incredible fortune decides to spend it not on buying art, but on fashioning a landscape. And in the story, Poe also imagines the Earth as seen from space as itself a complete work of art. In other words, he's the first character I can find who really anticipates the real ends of modernism. And this is Magritte's painting based on that. And of course, being Magritte, it's a pun. Egg is eagle in German. Arnheim is the connection between egg and eagle. So is not the totality of all our endeavours, all our social relations, tending towards the making over of the planet as a total work of art? This theme of a secular, aesthetic destiny has its roots in Romanticism, but lately it's lost its sort of optimistic cast. What if the work of art into which the world turns excluded the presence of its own makers? What if its creation destroyed the biological possibility of human life on the planet itself? So what light does aesthetics as a branch of thought and art as a contemplative practice shed on the possible ends of the world? What if we consider the end of the world as the finished product of aesthetic modernity? The blue ruin of the earth is the total work of art at the end of history. The earth will be buried at sea. Now, these matters are too serious to leave in the hands of technological optimists and apocalyptic doomsayers, and nor is moral scolding about doing the recycling either effective or adequate or even all that much fun as far as conceiving of a whole picture of climate change and its consequences. Rather, I think all this calls for an aesthetic sensibility oriented to the whole picture rather than to this or that aspect. There's a certain popular delight in imagining the world in ruins. It's a theme Benjamin identified early in the 20th century. In the shadow of the bomb, the Beats and their contemporaries occasionally gave it an incendiary cast. But what if we push beyond the picture of atomized cities to imagine not what passes but what is created at the end of human time? Our permanent legacy will not be architectural but chemical. After the last dam bursts, after the concrete monoliths crumble into the lone and level sands, modernity will leave behind a chemical signature in everything from radioactive waste to atmospheric carbon. And this will be a work of art, but it will be abstract, not figurative. Grasping this as a total work means understanding two tendencies in relation to each other, the global and the molecular. And the tendency toward the global and the tendency toward the molecular are combined in works such as Centre for Land Use Interpretation, doing guided tours of urban LA oil rigs or nuclear waste dumps in the salt flats where the tour bus becomes a kind of inside-out vitrine. In the wake of the vast oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the artist duo Übermorgen announce, oil painting has evolved into generative bioart, an oil painting on an 80,000 square mile ocean canvas. It's simply a matter of taking the next step from that scale and extending the parameters of the molecular aesthetic to the planetary limit. So such would be the contemplative path for art, a perspective in which the vanishing point is the cessation of life, in part, at least, such would be the contemplative path for art, a perspective in which the vanishing point is the cessation of life. The other path, the active or practical path, prepares us for a time already present when creative uses not just of technology, but of all the capacities of modernity will need to be put into play. As Hunter S. Thompson once put it, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. So in a sense, this is our moment. We come into the time of the artists, but hardly the kind of artists hitherto seen on Earth. This is my stock image of what the artist is in popular culture supposed to look like, right? So there might be something to learn, however, from certain exemplary practices of the past, and I want to talk about just one, Constant's New Babylon. Constant had photographs made of New Babylon and a film. He produced a newspaper for it. He gave his famous lecture performances. He actually invents the Starchitect lecture, even though he was never an architect. All to conjure into being a landscape that envisaged what was possible right here and now, but was merely held back by the fetter of outdated relations of production. And his work was not a utopia, And he said, I prefer to call it a realistic project because it distances itself from the present condition which has lost touch with reality, and because it is founded on what is technically feasible, on what is desirable from a human point of view, on what is inevitable from a social viewpoint. You've got to love the poignancy of saying he thought this was inevitable, from our perspective in the 21st century. The question that lingers is not whether New Babylon was merely a dream, I think, but whether the actually existing built form that we inhabit is not a nightmare. Now, New Babylon is a détournement, a hijacking, a plagiarism. I actually now want to say an echo based on one of the papers I heard today. I think echo is the same thing as détournement, but we'll talk about that later. It's a détournement not of art or literature, but of modern architecture and town planning. So in other words, it's this in negative. Rather than demolish the old world to build a radiant city, and rather than build a garden city on greenfield sites, Constant cantilevers new spaces up above, leaving both city and countryside untouched. Automated factories would be underground, the surface level is for transport, and while up above, a new landscape entirely devoted to play in massive superstructures of linked sectors, within which everything is malleable and changeable at whim. And a bit of it might look like that. Considered vertically as an elevation, New Babylon makes literal Marxist diagram of base and superstructure. Its area sectors up above are literally superstructures made possible by an infrastructure below, where mechanical reproduction has abolished scarcity and freed all of time from necessity. These are things that people in the 50s and 60s really thought could happen. And if we hadn't decided to go for massive amounts of cheap labour, it might possibly have come to pass. So it's an image of what Constant imagines the development of productive forces has made possible, but which the fetter of actually existing relations of production prevents from coming into being. Like many of the time, Constant was influenced by the cybernetic theories of Norbert Wiener, particularly his notion of a second industrial revolution. After wandering the streets of London and Manchester, Frederick Engels movingly recorded the human misery that resulted from the first industrial revolution. And that one had confounded modern artists who felt compelled to either reject industry or embrace it. But this debate was kind of now moot already in Constant's time. The first industrial revolution had given way to the second, a revolution in the use of information as a means of control. Now, cybernetics might just provide the means of mitigating the damage of the first industrial revolution while building on its enormous expansion of productive potential, or it could result in what Wiener called the fascist ant state. Constant takes to heart Engels' formula that communism reduces the state to the administration of things. Cybernetics as control is, in his diagram, pushed below ground to the world of administered things. Cybernetics as freedom, as the ability to connect anywhere, anytime, is in play in those superstructures up above. Constant pushes the debate about technicity to both extremes at once, both total control and total freedom. By pushing the instrumentalizing tendencies of cybernetic control to the limit, freedom from necessity appears in the realm of the possible. I should add that it's really an architecture of concepts. Whether you actually build this, I think, is really kind of moot. It's about how can you think spatially about how concepts are related. And he comes at this spatial arrangement of cybernetics as control, cybernetics as freedom by separating the two out. Now, Constant was not alone in imagining cybernetic automation to be a transformative development, but he was in rare company in seeing it in the context of social revolution. Well then, he says, how could such far-reaching automation be achieved without social ownership of the means of production, unquote. Automation changes the relations of production, which in turn changes social structures. The increase in productivity wrests freedom from necessity, but generates a surplus which needs dissipating somehow. New Babylon addresses the prospect of a new kind of necessity. As Constant says, automation inevitably confronts us with the question of where human energy would be able to discharge itself if not in productive work. One imagines here he must be reading Georges Bataille, but there's no evidence of that. So, sorry that doesn't have the resolution I would want. I love this picture because of the leather vest, like such a cool late 60s, early 70s kind of image there. There he is with a whole bunch of the sectors. This is the thing, this is art, to me, sophisticated art about technology. It's made out of bicycle spokes, people. Perspex and bicycle spokes. And all made by hand without prior diagrams. He didn't diagram this out first, it's physically made. The physical making of the thing is part of the spatiality of it, the feel of it. There's actually holes that don't have spokes going into them because he's changed his mind about where they go. It's also a collaborative project. Lots of people worked on this, including Guy Debord, incidentally. Can you imagine Guy Debord bending bicycle spokes and shoving them into bits of perspex? I love that image. So, pardon me. So beneath the ground, automated factories, across the surface, endless highways, and up above, a global network of infrastructures within which play takes place, without borders, without centres, without a state, and snakes and forks all over the map. New Babylon, he says, is organised according to the individual and collective covering of distance, of errancy, a network of units linked to one another, and so forming chains that can develop by extending in every direction. And up above all that, figuratively at least, up in the ether, is another network of communication. Constant intuited at least a few things about what will turn out to be the internet. And he says, a fluctuating world of the sectors calls on facilities, a transmitting and receiving network that are both decentralised and public. Given the participation of a large number of people in the transmission and reception of images and sounds, perfected telecommunications becomes an important factor in ludic social behaviour. I was talking to David just before about all of the videos of the and still images of the police expelling people from Zuccotti Park, which might be an interesting emblem of exactly this kind of network being realised, but not under the conditions that Constant prescribed for it. Right? Property has not been abolished. So through a decentralised network of communication, a nomadic species of play beings coordinates its frolicking designs and redesigns its own habitat and creates a life where the intensity of each moment destroys the memory that normally paralyses the creative imagination, as Constant says. Whoa, where did the next page go? 30. And I don't have page 31, so I'll just have to wing it from there. The thing I love about Constant is that he totally gets that contemporary communication is going to completely change the spatiality of the planet, right? Space is going to be completely disaggregated and rearranged. He gets that really in the late 50s in a way that I don't think many people did. He's completely right about this reconfiguration of space. He's completely wrong about the kind of space that's going to get built, right? So he imagines a utopia that got built in negative, in reverse. So instead of layering one layer on top of the other, what we did was spatially, alienate and separate things from each other completely. So no one knows. There's probably 80 million to 120 million industrial workers in China, like stamping out all of this crap, even as we speak, right? It's completely spatially separated from who gets to buy it, who designs it, who did the logo, and all that sort of stuff. So he's completely right, but completely wrong at the same time. But the thing about Constant is he's kind of imagining on a planetary scale how you could completely reorganise space and how it is used based on existing technologies, based on a path of automation that we were on and could have stayed on if cheap labour hadn't seemed like a more lucrative alternative at a certain point. The thing that's sort of poignant about it is that he kind of imagines this network extending over the entire surface of the planet, and about that he's right, but it wasn't this network. And nor did we build up. We didn't build space frames over the entire surface. We just built them at airports to move people on planes from one place to another instead. The poignant part to me is he actually thought the underlying planet was a substantial enough foundation to support the whole infrastructure. We now realise that's not the case. Like, that's the part that isn't doable in this whole diagram. And the other thing that you might notice is that rather than abolish work, we made it universal. So Constant is imagining that technology makes possible the abolition of work and the assigning of machines to all the things we don't want to do. And it seems like we did the opposite, that rather than play invading other activities, work invaded all of the activities that used to formerly be play. I challenge you to spend a day in New York City without watching people, in a sense, work in any possible interstitial moment that's available to them. Like people on the subway get their phones out and so on. But of course, we know the reverse is true also. Like, how many people, while they're at work, are actually on Facebook? But the sense in which, it's not a symmetrical relationship. Play got embedded in work, but work becomes the dominant form of the whole of social time. And the whole of it is based on this, in essence, on the greatest expansion of industrial production that the world has ever seen. It strikes me as somewhat fantastic that we still talk about a post-industrial age, when the exact opposite is true. This is the industrial age. It's just the industry isn't where we are. It's where other people are. So somehow we got this fantasy that we could call it post-industrial when it's just not. There are more people labouring to make this stuff than ever before in the history of the planet. It's just, this is a factory in China. It's not a factory that, where they used to be, right here in Manhattan. So, why am I talking about an artist from half a century ago? There's something about the scale on which he thought, but also at the same time the fineness, and also the holding back from a certain degree of detail as well. So this is about as detailed as you'd get in Constant in terms of the social imaginary of what everyday life could actually be like. He stopped short at infrastructure, in a sense, and kind of says the rest of it is up to you. He actually does the opposite to what most, and he really was a utopian, it's the opposite of most utopias. Utopias usually start by saying, the table's got to be round, right? If you read Thomas More, we got to sit at round tables, like they start specifying details of everyday life, and they work out from that, and they sort of lose focus as they get to larger structures. Constant's the absolute opposite of that. He only does the large structures. The rest of it is, the structure's permeable, make of it whatever you like. So in that sense, he gets lumped in with a whole chain of thinking when he's doing the opposite of what that chain usually does. And that to me is not the least interesting creative thing about it. But one has to ask, who among us is able to think on this scale? Even to mount temporarily the kind of optimism involved to think that you could actually reimagine the planet on this scale. Well, the thing is you actually now need to reimagine the planet on that scale, but without the optimism. So it's to kind of raise the stakes, but also raise the degree of difficulty on the whole exercise. So I personally feel I need to be kind of prepped with Constant as if it was some powerful drug before even entering into the thought of how one would think about an aesthetic practice where art meets technology, to conduct experiments that are obviously not, we don't have the capacity to build. His sectors, I figured this out with an architect, they're the size of maybe a third of Manhattan. It's not like we can go out and build that tomorrow, even with all the resources of the SVA, right? There's always this enormous gap between what one can think and what one can do. And this is, I think, a really key point to insist on. One has to be comfortable with the existence of the gap between what can be thought to be necessary and what can actually be done. To not be afraid, it's not a contradiction. It's the space of thought itself. It is not a contradiction to think something like Constant's New Babylon is what needs to actually be built, even though we completely lack the resources to do it, right? To not be told, oh, you're contradicting yourself, No, that's the gap. That's where thought's possible between those two things. Because what I notice is we tend to do the reverse, is that we chop off the possibility of thought to hive it back to what it is we think we can do, which is recycling plastic bottles, right? There's a program at my university, they abolished these. We don't have them, unless you want it with sugar in it and colouring, right? You want water, you can't get it because we shouldn't have the plastic bottles, but the ones with all the colouring in it, you can still get those. So you sort of think, how is that an ameliorative step, right? Doesn't that just really just make you feel better without doing anything at all? Wouldn't you be better off thinking in the gap between, well, this is just a ridiculous use of energy to build this stupid frickin' thing, but to have the gap between the two rather than try and make a few little symptoms go away. So that's why, while there's a certain strain of art and technology I do really admire when it does make specific interventions to achieve particular things, like roof gardening. There are artists who work on nothing but how you implant the garden into the space of the city, and I love that. But to not have it cut off that other avenue of thought, which is to think in the space between that which one can do and that which actually needs to be done, which would be, in a sense, really to reforest the entire city in some sense. So a work that keeps open that gap strikes me as kind of important. Because after all, we're talking in a sense about the need for a new entire infrastructure that's not really going to be built overnight, and for which the need does not really appear pressing to the powers that be. And in fact, the dominant line of thought is that if there's a contradiction between economics as a discipline and climatology, we have to imagine that climatology is not a limit to economics. Right? That's essentially where we've ended up. That if 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air is really where we ought to stop, but it's not economically feasible, then we'll actually just change the limit to 550, even though that probably puts the average temperatures up not 2 degrees, but 5 or 6, which isn't actually possible. without all sorts of bad things happening, right? But we just pretend all that doesn't happen. So the gap really does, if you like, exist, and we all think in it. But it seems to me a kind of knowledge that's not necessarily directly concerned with this on a day-to-day basis, but yet which encourages us to think in a way that is about being able to improvise with the aesthetic and the technical. Might not be a bad thing to work on. To work too much on climate change gets really depressing and no one really wants to do it, except for folks with a really strange and interesting subset of personalities. I'm glad they exist, but I just get A, bored, or B, depressed with this stuff. So it's not necessarily something that one should always directly be referring to, but is it possible to start creating spaces for practices that are about the kind of connection of the aesthetic to the technical and then to something else? I think there always needs to be a third piece to that equation. That leaves open the kinds of skills and abilities and talents that are going to incrementally be needed in the next 10 to 15 years, and then needed in enormous quantities in the decades that follow that. So I think my concern is how can I, as an educator, train people to, in a small number, to be able to train people in a larger number, as the penny drops, so to speak, that this is what we're going to have to be working on in the not too distant future. And I'll end with that key phrase that has worked for me for many decades. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And in this terrible recession economy, may you all get jobs when you graduate. Thank you.
The situation in terms of the theory that we have of information has advanced a long ways since Constantine and Wiener had it. But interestingly, the development of more positive or optimistic possibilities of the way we might use information haven't produced the kind of utopian visions that we have here. And I wonder if we can begin thinking of not necessarily building a material infrastructure, but building an information infrastructure that isn't nearly as expensive as going out and, say, replacing New York City.
Yeah, it's interesting that Google has a patent on server farms that can be anchored in the ocean and generate their own power. And they're based on two foreseeable questions, only one of which is to do with energy. The dirty little secret about the information economy is it takes huge amounts of power to run, and no one wants to talk about that. The other is jurisdictional, is how do you get information out of the hands of states that, as we're witnessing right now, want to pass extraordinary legislation to really just shut it down. We're witnessing the end of the internet as we speak. As a goal, as a concept, it's still technically the internet, but all of its, sort of goals and objectives will no longer apply. It'll be locked down as intellectual property, which is then used as a means of preventing free speech. That's now the goal. So yeah, it strikes me in that context that that's exactly what's required, and that's why, as you're absolutely right, that there's more sophisticated ways of thinking about information than Norbert Wiener, but not necessarily more sophisticated elaborations of a kind of conceptual space, a conceptual architecture for how you start imagining worlds otherwise. That was the part that kind of fell down.
That's what we didn't have developed. That's
yeah, and
needs to be working.
The way I'm sort of framing it as a problem, we have to take a step back and go, there's a problem with the way knowledge is organised, particularly in universities, which has got to do with blockages between disciplines and tendencies of disciplines to sort of motor on with their own kind of internal logics and debates, which is true also of the art world, that contemporary aesthetics develops as a set of permutations on given terms. This is Boris Goy's, right? And that's fine, but how can one, if you like, detorn that and make it connected and serviceable in terms of agendas that come from without? That strikes me as the key question. So how you rethink the space of what universities do to enable the thing that is not there would be as far as I can get with solving the problem. So rather than think, one has the answer to something, it's sort of like, well, an agent in a university, I'm going to try and change that space to make it possible. But there are other spaces as well, and the art world is a contingent one, where one could also start to think about exactly that.
At the beginning of your lecture, you suggested that modernity is related in some ways to crude, right? The idea
Sorry, to
oil.
Yeah.
To oil. The other aspect, though, of it is speed. I mean, this is the other aspect of modernity that is intrinsic to the construction of what it is to be human now in the 20th and 21st century. We just go a lot faster. I mean, the bottom line, nobody moved at 600 miles per hour in the 19th century. They did in the 20th. And that's changed in many ways who we are as a species. It's funny, I mean, I love Constant, but Buckminster Fuller actually also tried to do something in relationship to a kind of new mapping, if you will, of the world with something like the Dymaxion map, where he reorders the world. It's no longer, it's actually beyond a piece of artwork. It's actually a completely reconfigured idea based on the notion of speed. So I'm wondering if you have a comparison or how you think about that aspect of speed in relationship as well to some of these other issues you talked about.
I mean, Fuller doesn't really talk about property, and Constant does. I mean, Constant gets that, changing the relations of production is kind of part of it, and Fuller's very interesting, but just not someone who I've found terribly germane in certain respects. Don't really do speed because somebody else owns it. It's kind of like, I don't get proprietary rights, although I wrote about it a long time ago. And it might not just be the speed, it's the variability of the speeds and the ability to synchronize things in finer grain might be kind of the point. But I actually want to go in the other direction, which is to sort of say we lost the perspective that's, not 100 years or 300 years, but 300,000 years. That's sort of the perspective we're not able to think in a sense. I mean, there are extinction events related to climate change in the archaeological record, and that seems to me kind of relevant at the moment, that the speed that's kind of interesting to think in, it would be that one. So the Indus Valley civilizations just peter out, and for a long time no one knew why. And it turns out to be a climate event is the current, best science on why that happened. So that strikes me as a more interesting way to go. So I'm trying to extend the time horizon, in a sense, to one that's very, very large, but not as large as Quentin Meillassoux would make it, where it becomes, since the Big Bang, philosophers can kind of overshoot in lots of directions, you might notice. They're not always our friends in that regard. But the spatial scale, I wanted to get down to one that's very, very small. So how does things at the molecular level start to impinge on totalities? And Manuel de Landa has thought interestingly about that. But I want to actually extend it up to the kind of planetary scale. And the best book on that, for my money, is Cyclonopedia by Reza Negarestani, which is an amazing, trippy kind of book where oil is actually the central character. But if one takes a step back and thinks carbon more generally, he's from Iran, so of course it's all about oil, but I'm from New York, where it's all about the natural gas, right? So to think about carbon a little more generally and to make that the agent one thinks. And of course it's only one, there are others one could pick. But yeah, what does it mean to think of carbon as the essential subject of modernity, rather than the masses or rather than the working class or whatever? So it's to construct another narrative.
Could you just speak a little bit more when you said that you envision like spaces for practice between linking the aesthetic to the technical to a third thing? Could you just say a little more about what you might vision that to be?
Pardon me. Yeah, well, I think all of the contemporary works I was putting up, well, I only showed a few here, but they might sort of be gestures in that kind of direction. But yeah, how do you, not necessarily directly address an issue. I don't think art needs to have a content at all, but more just the form of it, open spaces where you get to see relations between, if you like, ontological layers that you would not otherwise have kind of perceived. That strikes me as what's kind of interesting about how to construct a practice. So, I just the one that I find astonishing is Übermorgen just deciding that an oil slick is their artwork. That's ours, and it's 80,000 square miles, in size, and you can actually buy, kind of prints of it. You know, there's documentation, so it's a real work of art. So I'm just kind of gobsmacked by the scale of it, you know, that isn't that an interesting way to think about the ready-made? And of course this one does have a little relation to content, but a kind of, you know, slightly quirky one. You know, it just kind of strikes me as interesting to start working along those lines.
I was wondering if you saw any linkages between Occupy Wall Street and the work of the Situationists, and if you could, I don't know if that's something you've written about, but it does strike me as being that sense of, it containing that sense of serious play and reappropriation of space that was spoken about in the Situationists in the 60s.
Oh yeah, I mean there's you know, probably some actually direct links, less in terms of people but in terms of texts. There's definite conceptual resonances. Renoir, who was a member of the Situationist International in his later years, said, our ideas are on everybody's minds. You know, it's just a question of how you get to that. You know, how do you, what breaks the seal, if you like, between, that makes everyone recognise that fact. So that strikes me as one. All the great SI slogans work in this context. That would strike me as one that's not often mentioned, that seems apropos. I kind of, you know, the Situationists wanted to transcend not only art but also politics. And for me, the occupation poses the question of whether politics actually exists or not. I mean, God is dead, right? But maybe so is the political. Maybe it's just dead. It's this imaginary thing that, you know, has an afterlife. If anybody's actually watched the Republican debates, it's not politics. It's politainment or something. You know, it's nothing to do with politics. Now, you know, inequality exists, state violence exists, exploitation exists. I'm not saying those things have gone away, but maybe there's no such thing as politics. You have to invent practices that would replace it or re-engage it. And that's definitely in the SI tradition, and that seems to me to be another way of understanding it. Crucial things about understandings of urban space. Greg Smith-Simon is a wonderful source of information on every single public square in New York City and who owns it and the wiring diagram underneath it. And he was explaining why it's important, the structure of ownership of that particular piece of land, made it available and so on. We know it was one of 5 possible sites that organisers had targeted as possibly being occupied when anticipating they'd get pushed off Wall Street. So the kind of tactical sensibility also comes back to the SI. This is stuff they thought about. And again, the SI, it's not about art. Situations are not about art. They're not about politics. There's certainly not an ethical or moral critique. It's about tactics. You know, Debord said more than once, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a strategist. So that sense of strategies in space. And the doubling of space, that you occupy physical space as a way of creating this resonance in an abstract space. That strikes me also as connected. And the sort of, let's call it the technology of the General Assembly is different to the Workers' Council model of the Situationists, but it's a refinement and development in the same line, it seems to me. And obviously it's one that has central personalities and marginal ones and all sorts of problems that any mode of organising has. But the idea of the invention of forms of organising outside of the state also seems connected in the thread that leads from the SI to the present. It's not the only thread, of course, but one can make this stuff work and make that connection. Besides which, I doubt there's an anarchist in America who lacks a copy of Society of the Spectacle. It's kind of, you know, essential reading.
Do you think there's any hope?
It's attributed to Gramsci, but I think Romain Rolland said it, but I'm just going to change it a little bit. Pessimism of the intellect, pessimism of the will. You're asking the wrong person about this one. And you know, it may have to do with national culture. I'm an Australian, we're a pessimistic people. You know, Americans had Lewis and Clark, who, you know, Native Americans got on from one side of the continent all the way to the other. We had Burke and Wills, who got all the way from the bottom, all the way to the top, almost all the way back down, and died in the desert, surrounded by food they didn't know how to eat, you know. So I just come from a pessimistic place, essentially, you know. You know, your guys went out in the Midwest and found this bounty of land that they could farm you know, for hundreds of years. Our guys went out in the desert and found a desert, you know. They didn't know how to live in because they had, you know. So, yeah, I don't know that optimism's even necessary. You know, is it even necessary? I don't know that one needs hope, actually. I mean, Beckett certainly didn't have it, and look at him. Like, what a great career, what fantastic work. It's absolutely without hope, you know. So I can't go on, I'll go on. That seems enough for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.